The Highway of Time. The highway stretched endlessly beneath the truck's headlights, a ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into the abyss of the desert night. The only sound was the low rumble of the diesel engine and the occasional crackle of static from the CB radio. Jake Callahan had been driving for hours, his fingers wrapped tightly around the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the unbroken horizon. He was somewhere in the Arizona desert, heading west toward Los Angeles with a last-minute haul. The job had come through a dispatcher he barely knew. High pay, no questions asked. Just get the cargo from El Paso to LA, and don't ask what's in the container. He had done enough runs like this to know that curiosity didn't pay. Jake reached for his coffee, the Starbucks logo worn from too many refills. He took a sip. Lukewarm. Bitter. His eyes flicked to the dashboard clock. 2:47 a.m. Too late to call anyone. Too early for the morning rush. Just him and the road. Outside, the desert sprawled in every direction, a sea of shadows under the cold silver light of the moon. The occasional Joshua tree jutted from the earth like skeletal arms, swaying slightly in the wind. No streetlights. No headlights in his rearview mirror. Just empty, open road. He liked it this way. Quiet. No distractions. The CB radio crackled again. Static at first, then a faint, distorted voice that barely registered over the hum of the truck. Anyone out there? Jake frowned, reaching for the dial. Damn signal's weak out here, he muttered. He turned the knob, but the voice was gone. Just white noise. Probably some trucker 50 miles off, picking up interference. He exhaled, shaking off the unease creeping up his spine. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker on the road ahead. A shimmering distortion, like heat waves rising from the asphalt. But that didn't make sense. It wasn't hot. The temperature gauge read 43 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air outside was crisp. Jake blinked. The flicker grew. A swirling haze formed just beyond his high beams, shifting and twisting like liquid light. It danced on the road, warping the air around it. Jake's hands tightened on the wheel. What the hell is that? He let off the gas, his instinct screaming that something wasn't right. But before he could react, the truck crossed into the distortion. The world around him shattered. For a split second, everything went black. No sound, no road beneath him, no truck around him. Just an empty, suffocating void. Then, the explosion hit. The night was suddenly blazing with fire and chaos. Jake's vision snapped back into focus, but the highway was gone. The road beneath his wheels was no longer asphalt. It was cobblestone, rough and uneven. The tires skidded, fighting for traction, the truck's weight groaning as it lurched forward. The air was thick with smoke and ash, the scent of burning wood and gunpowder filling his lungs. The sky was no longer the deep black of the desert night. It was blood red, streaked with fire and destruction. Jake slammed on the brakes. The truck screamed in protest, the trailer fishtailing as the entire rig skidded across the unfamiliar ground. His pulse thundered in his ears. What the hell is happening? Then, movement. At first, just silhouettes through the smoke. Then figures. People. Running. Jake barely had time to register them before they came into view. Men, women, and children, dressed in clothing centuries old. Soldiers in blue coats, their muskets raised. Civilians in tattered rags, fleeing through the smoke. Jake's stomach twisted. No, 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 this isn't possible. A cannon boomed to his left, the ground shaking with the force of the blast. Wood splintered. A building collapsed in flames. Jake's breathing turned ragged, his hands slick with sweat on the wheel. Then, something struck the windshield. A body. A man. His face twisted in agony, his chest covered in blood. Jake barely had time to react before the man rolled off the hood and vanished beneath the truck. Jake's stomach lurched violently. No, 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 and no. His hands fumbled for the door handle. He shoved it open, his boots hitting the cobblestone street with a thud. The air was hot, filled with the sounds of war. Another explosion. More screaming. His breath hitched as he turned his head and realized where he was. Beyond the burning buildings, through the haze of smoke, he saw it. A flag. Stars and stripes. 13 stars. The American Revolution. Jake staggered back against the truck, his entire body trembling. His mind screamed at him that this wasn't real, this couldn't be real. But the heat of the flames, the metallic scent of blood in the air, the sheer terror on the faces of the people running past him, it was too vivid. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. He was here. He had driven straight into history. Another cannon thundered in the distance, and Jake instinctively ducked. A musket ball whizzed past his head, splintering the wooden post behind him. His truck, his 18-wheeler, stood in the middle of the 18th century, surrounded by chaos. And then, the soldiers saw him. The truck's massive tires crushed cobblestones beneath them, the vibrations rattling Jake's bones as he barreled through history. The roar of the diesel engine was deafening against the sounds of muskets cracking, cannons booming, and screams filling the air. He clenched the wheel tighter, his pulse hammering in his ears. This isn't real. This can't be real. But it was. The smell of burning wood and gunpowder filled the cab. The shattered passenger side mirror swung limply, fractured from a musket ball. The air outside was thick with ash, buildings collapsing around him as redcoats and revolutionaries battled in the streets. A cannon fired directly ahead. Jake's instinct screamed move, and he wrenched the wheel left. The truck's 18-wheeler frame groaned, tires skidding violently on the slick cobblestone. The cannonball slammed into the street just feet from where he had been, sending stone and debris flying in all directions. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps. His brain was still desperately trying to rationalize the impossible, trying to convince him that he had drifted off at the wheel, that this was some kind of hyper-realistic nightmare, that at any second he'd wake up back in Arizona, the Starbucks coffee cup still warm in his hand. But he wasn't waking up. The CB radio crackled to life. Static, then a distorted voice, barely audible over the chaos. "Do not belong. Pull out." Jake's heart clenched. "Who is this?" he shouted, one hand flying to the radio. "Highway time escape." The radio cut out. Jake's stomach churned. He gritted his teeth and tried to process it later. He had bigger problems right now. More soldiers emerged from the smoke, muskets raised, their expressions twisted with pure confusion and terror. The massive truck, its gleaming metal cab and towering trailer, was a nightmare from their future, an impossible machine thundering through their war. Jake didn't know if they saw him as a weapon or a demon, and he didn't want to stick around to find out. He had to get out of here. Now, the street narrowed, wooden houses and shops pressing in on either side. He had no idea where he was going. He only knew he had to keep moving. Then, through the haze, he saw it. A massive stone archway, standing at the edge of the battlefield, its intricate carvings barely visible through the smoke. Beyond it, the road looked different. It shimmered, like the distortion he had seen before he was pulled into this madness. A way out, his only way out. Jake's breath hitched. He gunned the engine, forcing the truck forward, tires spinning against the cracked road. Then, a figure ran directly in front of him. Jake slammed the brakes, the truck screeching to a stop. His body lurched forward, barely caught by his seatbelt. The figure staggered backward, staring at the truck with wide, terrified eyes. He was young, no older than 19, dressed in a tattered blue coat and holding a musket. Blood stained his side, but his grip on the weapon was firm. His face was dirty, sweat dripping from his forehead. Jake knew that face. The history books had shown it 100 times. Nathaniel Reed, a soldier, a revolutionary, a name etched into American history. Jake's blood ran cold. Nathaniel Reed wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this battle. Not tonight. He wasn't supposed to die here. Jake sat frozen, hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Nathaniel took a shaky step forward, his musket still clutched tightly in his hands. He was looking directly at Jake, at the truck, at this monstrous thing that shouldn't exist in his world. Jake's breath caught in his throat. If Reed stayed in this battlefield, he wouldn't live to lead the charge at Saratoga. He wouldn't go on to write the letters that would later influence the Constitution itself. He wouldn't be there to play his part in history. Jake had seen enough late-night documentaries to understand what this meant. He had just changed time. Panic surged through him. I can't let him die here. I can't let this happen. Another cannon fired, and Jake acted on instinct. He threw the door open, jumped from the cab, and ran. The ground shook beneath him. Nathaniel staggered back as Jake grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the wreckage. "Move, kid," Jake roared, the words instinctive. He didn't know if Nathaniel understood him, but his eyes widened as another cannonball exploded where he had just been standing. Jake's boots pounded against the cobblestones as he dragged Nathaniel with him, moving toward the archway. The distortion, the way home. The archway shimmered brighter, the distortion swirling in impossible patterns. It was unstable. It wouldn't stay open forever. Jake didn't know how this was happening, why this was happening, but he had one chance to escape. Nathaniel stumbled, struggling to keep up. He looked back, saw the battlefield burning, his fellow soldiers fighting, dying, his face twisted with confusion, fear, and duty. Jake stopped at the threshold, his lungs burning, his mind racing. Nathaniel hesitated, staring at the glow of the archway, then back at his war. Jake knew the look in his eyes. Nathaniel couldn't leave. This was his time, his war, his fate. If he left now, it could change everything. The CB radio crackled again, a voice barely pushing through the static. Time must remain unbroken. Jake clenched his teeth. His mind screamed. He looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at him. Then, Jake shoved him back toward the battlefield. Nathaniel's eyes widened in shock. Jake didn't wait for a reaction. He stepped backward and fell through the archway. Light swallowed him whole. Jake gasped as the road reappeared beneath him. The truck lurched violently, the force of impact shaking the entire cab. His hands flew to the wheel. His foot slammed the brake. The truck skidded across the empty highway, finally rolling to a stop. Silence. Jake's entire body trembled. He was back in Arizona. The desert stretched out around him, unchanged. The road was still empty. The clock on the dashboard blinked 2:47 a.m. Had it only been a moment? His breath came in shaky gasps as he reached for the CB radio. His fingers trembled. Hello? His voice was barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, a voice. The past remembers, Jake. Be careful what you leave behind. The radio went dead, and on the passenger seat, lying where there had been nothing before, was a musketeer's bullet, stained with time. Jake sat motionless in the cab, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The highway stretched before him, empty and still, the desert night pressing in around him. His heart pounded in his ears, the weight of what had just happened sinking into his bones. The musketeer's bullet sat on the passenger seat, its surface worn and darkened, a relic from a war that had ended centuries ago. But Jake had been there. He had seen it burn, had felt the heat of the cannon fire, had pulled Nathaniel Reed from death's grip, only to shove him back into his fate. The past had taken him, thrown him into its chaos, and now it had left something behind. Jake exhaled sharply, forcing himself to move. His hands were still shaking as he reached for the CB radio, his fingers brushing over the dial. "Anyone out there?" he said, his voice hoarse. This is Callahan. Anyone reading me?" Silence. Then, a crackle of static. "Jake." The voice sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't the same distorted voice from before. It was clearer now, familiar. He swallowed hard. "Who is this?" The radio crackled again. "The past isn't done with you." Jake jerked his hand away from the receiver. The cab felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in, pressing against his chest. He forced himself to take deep, steady breaths. Maybe it was just the shock messing with his head. Maybe he'd fallen asleep at the wheel, drifted into some kind of lucid dream, and his brain was still trying to pull itself back together. Yeah, that was it, right? His eyes drifted back to the bullet on the seat, and his stomach twisted. No, that wasn't a dream, and the past wasn't done with him. Jake pulled the truck back onto the road, his muscles still tense. He needed to move, to keep driving, to put distance between himself and whatever the hell had just happened. The highway stretched ahead, empty and endless, but something felt off. The billboards that lined the road were wrong. Not just new, but different in ways he couldn't explain. One of them, a massive ad for Pepsi, had a slogan he didn't recognize. Pepsi, the official drink of the revolution. Jake's breath caught in his throat. That wasn't right. His grip on the wheel tightened. He drove another mile before he spotted another sign. An election campaign poster plastered on the side of an abandoned gas station. Nathaniel Reed for president. Jake slammed the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He stared at the poster, his head spinning. Nathaniel Reed, the man he saved on the battlefield. A man who was never supposed to survive that night. Jake shoved the door open, his boots hitting the asphalt as he stalked toward the gas station, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The poster was old, weathered by time, but the name was clear as day. Nathaniel Reed, President of the United States, 1876. Jake felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. He had changed something. No, he had changed everything. Jake stumbled back toward the truck, his mind racing. This wasn't just a minor change. Nathaniel Reed wasn't supposed to survive that night. He was supposed to die in the chaos, another nameless soldier in the war for independence. But Jake had saved him, and because of that, he had become something else. A leader, a president, a man who wasn't supposed to exist in history. Jake's chest felt tight. How much had changed? He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone. His fingers moved on autopilot as he searched for something, anything that could prove he was losing his mind. He opened Google, but the search bar wasn't there. Instead, a blinking cursor appeared beneath a logo he didn't recognize. ReedNet. Jake's stomach twisted. He typed in one word, American Revolution. The screen flickered. The results loaded, but the headlines were wrong. General Nathaniel Reed, the man who won the war, the Reed Doctrine. How one president shaped a nation, the Great Divide. What would America look like if Washington had led instead? Jake's pulse roared in his ears. Washington hadn't led? He stumbled back into the truck, his entire body trembling. He clicked on another link, skimming the historical timeline. It wasn't just Nathaniel Reed who had changed. The entire war had played out differently. Washington had been wounded early on. Without him, the revolution's leadership had shifted. Reed had stepped into the power vacuum, guiding the war in his own way. And he had won. Differently. Brutally. Jake scrolled through the text, his vision blurring. Executions. Martial law. A war that lasted years longer than it should have. And then, A final gut punch. Nathaniel Reed had abolished the presidency in 1880. America had never become a democracy. Jake's breath hitched in his throat. He had saved one man and destroyed the world he knew. The CB radio hissed again, the sound slicing through the silence of the cab. Jake's hands were clammy, his entire body rigid with fear. He reached for the receiver, his fingers trembling. "Jake." The voice was closer this time. "Who are you?" Jake's voice came out hoarse. "You have to go back." Jake's breath caught. Go back? Before he could respond, the radio cut out again, replaced by silence. But Jake didn't need to hear more. He knew what he had to do. Somehow, someway, he had to go back. Back to that battlefield. Back to that night. And this time, Nathaniel Reed had to die. Jake Callahan sat behind the wheel of his truck, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His hands trembled against the steering wheel. His eyes remained locked on the weathered campaign poster of President Nathaniel Reed, a man who should never have lived past that night on the battlefield. I did this. The thought burrowed deep into his brain, a parasite gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He had changed history, not in a way that could be ignored, not in some harmless ripple. He had broken it, and the past wasn't done with him. The CB radio crackled to life again. "Jake." His blood turned to ice. The voice was closer now, no longer distorted by static. "Go back." Jake swallowed hard, his stomach twisting into knots. "How?" he rasped. His throat was dry, his body cold despite the desert heat creeping in through the windshield. Silence. Then, a faint hum. The dashboard clock blinked erratically, numbers flickering in and out like a glitching computer screen. 2:47 a.m. 2:47 a.m. 2:47 a.m. The time refused to change, as if the world itself had locked him in a loop, waiting for him to fix what he had done. The truck's engine rumbled softly, idling on the empty highway. But something felt different now, like the road beneath him wasn't entirely solid, like the world itself was hesitating, caught between past and present. He exhaled sharply. There was only one way out of this. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the musketeer's bullet, the one that had appeared on his passenger seat after he returned from the battlefield. A relic, a piece of history that did not belong here. He rolled it between his fingers, his pulse hammering. If history had left something behind in his world, maybe he could return the favor. Maybe he could find the way back. Jake threw the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The tires screeched against the asphalt, the massive rig roaring forward, slicing through the desert night like a bullet. The highway signs blurred past, unreadable, as if they weren't meant to exist in this version of reality. The headlights carved a path through the dark, but Jake wasn't looking at the road anymore. He was searching for the shimmer, the distortion that had swallowed him before, dragging him into a war that had ended centuries ago. And then, there it was, a faint ripple in the air, hovering just above the asphalt, barely visible, but unmistakable. Jake's stomach clenched. This was it, the way back. But there were no guarantees this would work. If he was wrong, if this wasn't a portal, if this wasn't the same anomaly that had pulled him into the past, then he would be launching himself blindly into oblivion. He clenched his teeth. There was no choice. He had to fix this. He had to go back. Jake tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles white, his foot pressing harder on the pedal. 90 miles per hour. The shimmer grew closer. 100 miles per hour. The CB radio crackled again, but this time, the voice was screaming. Jake, 120 miles per hour. He braced himself. The truck slammed into the distortion. Everything went black. Heat, smoke, gunfire. The roar of cannon split the night, and Jake wrenched the wheel to the left, his tires skidding over cobblestone once more. He was back. The battlefield was alive again. Screams tore through the air. soldiers charging past his truck, oblivious to the impossible machine that had just reappeared in their war. Jake's mind raced. He had seconds to find Nathaniel Reed. He threw the door open, jumped from the cab, and hit the ground running. The heat of the fires burned against his skin. Gunpowder stung his eyes. His boots slammed against the cobblestone as he pushed forward, weaving through soldiers, dodging musket balls whizzing past his head. Then, he saw him. Nathaniel Reed was 50 feet ahead, crouched behind a collapsed wooden cart, reloading his musket. His eyes were locked on something across the battlefield. He didn't see Jake coming. Jake's lungs burned. This is it. This was the moment where history had broken. This was where he had interfered before, where he had saved Reed from dying. Jake's mind screamed at him. Fix it. Fix it now. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers closing around the bullet, the one that had followed him into the present. His body moved on instinct, acting before his brain could fully comprehend the weight of what he was about to do. He stepped forward, raised his arm, and threw the bullet directly at Reed's back. The bullet hit Reed square between his shoulder blades, right where a real shot should have struck him that night. Nathaniel jerked forward, his musket falling from his hands, his body collapsing onto the battlefield. Jake's chest heaved as he watched the life drain from the man's eyes. The war raged on around him, but he barely heard it. The weight of what he had done crushed him. He had come back to kill a man he had once tried to save, a man who had begged for his life with his eyes, even if no words had passed between them. And now, he was gone. But, as Jake took a shaking breath, the battlefield around him began to blur. The smoke thickened, the ground trembled, the sounds of war stretched and warped, fading into something distant, something impossible. The universe was correcting itself. Jake felt it, a force pulling at his very soul, dragging him away from this place, pulling him back to where he belonged. He closed his eyes and let it take him. Jake gasped as the highway reappeared beneath him. The truck lurched forward, its massive frame settling back onto the road. The dashboard clock read 2:48 a.m. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, time had moved forward. Jake exhaled, his entire body trembling. The billboards along the highway were back to normal. No President Nathaniel Reed. No strange history. The past had been restored. He reached into his pocket, his fingers searching for the bullet. It was gone. Jake swallowed hard, gripping the wheel with both hands. He had done it. But as the CB radio crackled to life one final time, his stomach twisted. A voice whispered through the static. Not the past. Not the unknown force that had been guiding him. It was a new voice. A woman's. Jake Callahan, you should never have gone back. The radio cut to silence. And far in the distance, for just a split second, he saw another shimmer on the road ahead. Jake Callahan gripped the wheel, his breath shallow, his fingers cold despite the heat radiating from the truck's engine. The CB radio was silent now, but the woman's voice still echoed in his skull. You should never have gone back. His pulse pounded. The highway stretched out before him, dark and empty, as if the world had been holding its breath. The desert wind howled softly outside, pushing against the truck's frame. Jake swallowed hard. He had done what needed to be done. The past was corrected. Nathaniel Reed was dead. The history books would never mention a President Reed. The war had played out as it was always meant to. Everything should be normal again. And yet, ahead, in the distance, the air shimmered. Another distortion. Jake's gut twisted. No, this was over. He pressed his foot against the gas pedal, speeding up, trying to outpace the anomaly. But as he moved closer, it didn't disappear. Instead, it grew. A new tear in time. Jake's breath hitched. The past was not done with him. He had made a mistake, not by changing history, but by thinking that history wouldn't notice. Jake's grip tightened on the wheel. His mind raced. He had fixed it, hadn't he? He had put time back the way it was meant to be. So why was it still calling him? His chest tightened as a sick realization hit him. The moment he had stepped into the past, he had broken a rule he didn't understand. Time had seen him, and time never forgets. He was no longer just a trucker on the road. He was a traveler now, and the past was still bleeding. The ripple hadn't just touched one moment. It had spread, fracturing across other places, other times. Jake had tried to fix it, but time was pulling him back in. He was marked now, a wanderer between centuries, and there was no going home. The distortion loomed ahead, stretching wider, shimmering like a mirage in the desert heat. Jake slammed the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. The dashboard lights flickered, the CB radio crackling with whispers. Voices too many to count, from too many times to name. Jake's breath shook as he reached for the radio. The woman's voice returned. Soft, steady. You don't belong here anymore, Jake. Jake's chest ached. His entire life. The long, lonely miles on the road. The endless hauls from one city to the next. The routine that had always kept him moving forward. All of it felt distant now, like a memory that didn't quite fit. He knew, deep down, that if he drove away from this anomaly, if he chose to ignore it, he would never be safe. Time would keep calling him back. The past would not let go. And maybe it never had to. Jake exhaled slowly. His fingers relaxed on the wheel. He reached for the gear shift. One last haul. Not across state lines. Not to another city, but through time itself. His foot pressed against the gas. The truck lurched forward, the engine roaring as it charged toward the distortion. The shimmer swallowed him whole. And just like that, Jake Callahan was gone. Epilogue. The man who never stopped driving. The highway was empty. The truck was gone. The CB radio sat in silence, its receiver hanging loosely from its cord. The wind howled softly across the desert, kicking up dust along the asphalt. For a long time, nothing moved. Then, a faint crackle. The radio came to life. Jake Callahan, if you can hear this, wherever you are, keep driving. A pause, then static, and far off in the distance, across some forgotten road that should not exist, a truck's headlights flickered. Still moving, still driving, through time,